I've been meaning to address the recent absence for a good amount of time now, and it has been challenging, to say the least. Everything's fine. I'm having fine mental state. It shouldn't be a point of concern. I just had to start working full-time for insurance reasons, and recently I have been crushed by the wheels of industry. The 15 hours a week that I was able to dedicate to the channel is now just more working time. And it doesn't just boil down to actual time investment, because whenever you make something, I like to think that there are 3 resources that are being exhausted. You have time, which is the easiest to explain, energy, which is your ability to do things, and then concentration, or how you can concentrate on a task. And we can think about this in different ways, but generally I think a good example would be an operation that takes time but not energy or concentration is like when you scan in documents. It takes a lot of time, but you just hit the button and maybe resize the window and then go to the next one. There are other things that take a lot of time and a lot of concentration, and the different tasks in video production in general take different amounts. Like editing, for instance, is pretty time intensive, but not necessarily the most concentration or energy intensive. In fact, you can do a lot with what you have, and planning the tasks around what you have in the moment is important. Obviously, recording takes a good amount of energy, and it takes, well, the amount of time that is spent actually recording is much longer than you would expect. Some things are done in 1 take, but most of the time it takes 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 takes to get it right. Certain words, like the word similarly, is just very difficult for me to say, and yet I keep writing it in the script, which is on my part. Script writing is also pretty concentration, but not necessarily too high energy. I do think that I want to explain it with monkey minutes sometime, but that is beyond the scope of this video. The main thing is to address the hiatus and future plans. Speaking of which, future hiatus, I think it might be a good idea to just have a regularly scheduled break after May each year, just because that seems to be a habit that's forming when I make quite a lot of videos in May for Yu-Gi-Oh! Nostalgia Month, which I quite enjoy and am looking forward to in the next few months. But it just leads to not even burnout, just lack of time in the following months. It's a balancing act. You lose the ability to tackle some of the topics, and it's always juggling those resources around. In addition to working full-time, I've also had to go to court like half a dozen times total. The next session I have is Wednesday the 15th of December. And I've got selected as a grand juror, well, technically an alternate for the grand juror, but that means I listen to a lot of cases, and it's just my luck because of changes in legislation recently. Only violent felonies go to grand jury. Out of respect for both the audience and for the accused and the victims, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I might tackle my experience with the criminal justice system at some point, just because it's interesting, and it is the first time I feel like I've truly had my moral, not necessarily compass, but composure, challenged in a meaningful way. It is interesting because I think of myself as having the moral fortitude, but not direction, of Judge Dredd. And being in one of the actual positions is a little bit different. It's heavy and uncomfortable, not just during, but after for quite some time. It takes the ability to decompress. It's a time-consuming process. And obviously, I don't want to record directly after because it affects the voice quality. Not just voice cracking or difficulty focusing, but I sound sad, and that just doesn't make for good video production. A third thing is also sapping some of the time, and I've been doing more videography projects outside of the channel, some of which I guess I could link in, but those are mostly with family. I've gotten much better equipment recently. So I got some professional lights, 4K video camera, but it's 4K at 24 FPS. Different tripod. Microphone stand actually is quite helpful. I'm no longer on the yoga ball and can have pretty consistent audio. It is incompatible with my desk though, so I actually have a little stool in front of me because the fancy bevel cut at the edge of the desk means I can't put the microphone stand on it. Another reason why I like tables. But I am planning, as far as future projects, perfect transition, to go over equipment sometime, just as a bonus video. But it's one of the things that I'm a little curious about is the interplay between branding and content. Just figuring out that a portion of the audience comes for different reasons. Sometimes they're overlapping Venn diagrams, but sometimes they're exclusive. And I want to be able to give the existing audience something similar to what they're expecting. Of course, there's always room for innovation and change, and projects are not always going to line up with everyone's taste, and that is completely fine. I think one of the circles in the Venn diagram is definitely Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. And to some degree, I do feel the pigeonholing in which there might be pressure because people play just one game at a time. Understandably so, there's an enormous commitment as far as information and energy required to transition to a game. And that's not even considering the financial component, because decks, even low-grade decks in certain games, can be quite expensive. I understand why people have strong allegiance or sunk cost when they want to transition or change. And there's also the information barrier. If I would talk about another game, I have to be very careful so that I don't lose too many people as far as complexity. Because I can say terms from other games that are not universal, like mana rock. And in my mind, it's an artifact. It's like 2 or 3 mana, and it taps for a colorless mana. But that's not universal. Not just within mana rocks, but I mean, it's not something that everyone would know, especially if you're coming from Yu-Gi-Oh! Where there's not that resource system. It could be interesting to make a video series that talks going from one card game to another, a brief introduction, to show which terms and which concepts can be easily translated. Like, the word bounce is probably pretty universal. It means to return to deck. And you bounce things in blue and magic, you bounce things with compulsory evacuation device, you bounce things with sap and Hearthstone. Pretty simple. Not all the things are like that, though. Figuring out what kind of content is a struggle. I might want to do more game digressions. I'm not worried about viewership, I'm just worried about not delivering what people came for. I don't want there to be the feeling of a bait and switch, where you came with one set of expectations, and I am unable to fulfill those expectations that I set. If there are external expectations which are being applied upon my channel, though, then I don't feel obligated to try to maintain that. I mean, this TCGT cast is in itself being repurposed and focusing more on the TCGT branding, which is difficult to spell out because letters are hard. It is moving away from talking about just card games and having a bit of a meta discussion, but I think it's useful for communicating with the audience in a way that is elective and not on the main channel. It is a little bit challenging because I expect there to be just a tiny fraction of viewership to get the information. So it's going to be accompanied by a community post and potentially even a poll looking at some of the options that I'm about to talk about as far as future plans and direction of the channel, dealing with the lack of time and some of the other recording difficulties. On to the actual future plans. I do want to have a return to form, maintaining as many traditions as I can. The most immediate one is going to be a Christmas Day video, which is going to be opening product. I actually already have the product. I have the camera. I'm missing the lights at the moment, so I need to go get those from family. But it's going to not be cards this time. It's actually going to be some other product. I think it's officially licensed. Going to explain that later. As far as video ideas, I have one called Lonely Monster, which is going to be fun. That one is challenging because I just need several days, several complete days in a row where I can work on it because it's time sensitive. It's a data video, and if data comes out immediately during the video, it might affect how people react to it and how people interact with it. It's okay if I'm wrong. It's okay because I cannot foresee things happening in the future. But to the best of my abilities, I want it to come out as timely and accurate as possible. Then, this is more for another TCGT cast. That label is hard. And just talking about banning philosophy, I have like 7 pages of script written out, and it is just not coming together in a way that I think is meaningful. One of the pretty common requests that I've had is just writing longer videos, and I could not do that with the weekly schedule just because of the amount of time investment. I can do longer discussions with lower editing time on the TCGT cast, but those will be a little less structured and a little less focused. Some people will prefer that I have a general outline of topics and maybe meander a bit too much in one area or another. My big fear being that I will repeat myself unnecessarily. Some degree of repetition is okay because it reinforces concepts and helps with learning, but a lot of people don't like redundancy. So the banning philosophy video might come out on the channel with an additional block of information in this sort of context. Adjacent and probably largely contributing to the banning philosophy is meaningful and efficient counterplay, which is a long phrase, but I think each word is, well, maybe not the conjunction and, but the 3 big words in the phrase are all distinct and required. So meaningful in this context is the answer to the question fully answering the question. Efficient, is it costing you too much in order to answer the question? And counterplay is the general word for counterplay. That's going to be a video, and it ties into a larger topic. One of the things that I like and dislike in Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just how many obscure cards there are that just are made for the anime. Like Call to the Grave that just doesn't like Call of the Haunted, or Jar Robber that doesn't like Pot of Greed but is useless otherwise. I know people have already talked about how these cards are not good, and I'm not going to say that they're good, but I think explaining to people why Jar Robber in particular is not good is a little bit informational and very valid, because if Pot of Greed were played at 3, I still don't think Jar Robber would see play, despite being a spell speed 2 counter on a spell card for some reason, and being a +1 in card advantage, because you would negate Pot of Greed and then you yourself draw a card. That's really efficient, but it's not meaningful in the sense that it's really specific, and it actually fails in dealing with Pot of Greed if they go first, but that's the topic for its own discussion. I think looking at a lot of the incongruities within the game, how there are so many characteristics in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it seems like some of them are valued much higher than others, and you just get different amounts of counterplay as a result. It seems like machines have a lot of counter cards, and then just you have System Down and Acid Rain, and there's quite a number of anti-machine cards that you don't exactly see in other types. I like Paralyzing Potion and Germ Infection, how they only hit certain types, or certain types are immune to both of those equip cards. I think that's fascinating and really good flavorful design, but not necessarily good design because there's just so many characteristics. You have attribute, type, level, and of course archetype status, which is mostly in the name. Not always. I mean, like fire monsters with 200 defense isn't specific to the Flameveil archetype, but Rekindling sort of pulls other cards into that deck. Same thing with zombies or dark monsters with 0 defense. But that's also getting off topic. As far as other things that I've been up to, I have the big capstone project, which I've been working on. Being away from the computer quite a lot, I've had more pen and paper development time, which is good and bad. I have like 6 front-back handwritten pages of script for just the capstone project. And after typing it up, I think I'm like 15,000 words in. Still have a substantial amount to go. But that's going to be just a plan. Maybe I'm going to have to postpone it to like 2022. Or 2022 is just in 1 month. Might have to postpone it even further to 2023. Just because it's taking a long time, and I'm halfway through the writing process, or almost halfway through the writing process, and then on top of that you have the editing, and then the graphics need to be developed, and then a lot of structure and video production on top of it, because it's going to be a multimedia project. Also on pen and paper development time, and something that may be released in a more timely manner, I've been working with a different medium, completely different subject material, called Project Rho. Rho like the Greek character, just for fun. It's good to be able to decompress and defragment a little bit, because I have quite a lot of ideas, and just getting some down on paper clears up a little bit of room, a little bit of thinking space, so I don't have to worry so much about it. But I am working more, and as a result, creatively frustrated isn't the right word. It's like the opposite of burnout, where I have so many ideas and need to get them out, but not necessarily the amount of time or energy necessary, and of course not the amount of concentration to do them justice. I am thinking about talking about other games, not in the sponsorship sense where I have gotten a game offer and will bring my audience to this obvious cash grab or gambling simulator, because I think that just completely violates my ethics. Which, as far as future plans and ethics, I am planning an entire cast that's just going to talk about where I draw my ethical lines as far as sponsorship and money, which it's going to be gauche. And I think it's unavoidable, but having a pretty public record of what I have as far as ethical paradigm should be important information for everyone. It's not terribly complex, but I have gotten some sponsorship offers, and going forward with a larger channel or with the ability to market towards more people, I have to be extremely conscious, and I want to be consistent in the way that I use them. If I choose to use them. At this point, I don't want to. I'm also thinking about channel membership and Patreon, but the big hang up I have on those two things isn't the financial support. That's not the problem. It's the fact that it would section off content, and even extremely minor content. Like, you get different badges based on what tier if you're a YouTube member, and that's a tiny little cosmetic, but I don't want to alienate people. Because some people will want it, or some people will see it, and then they'll feel bad because they can't do it. And that's for any number of reasons. You could be in a position where you're just not financially able to, a student, or between jobs, unemployed, but you still enjoy the content. And I just never want content to be restricted in a meaningful way. I'm still on the fence on whether or not just to post things earlier for people that pay. Everyone's going to get it eventually, but it's just such a bad expectation that it puts over some people. I do think that freely available content, really important. That is one of the foundations of the channel, is make sure that I'm inclusive and covering topics that I think are interesting. As far as other future projects, this is straying even further away from the channel branding and the previous content on the main channel, but that's okay, because this is freeform and lower stakes on the second channel, where I have 4 subscribers, which is refreshing. I've gotten a few requests for affirmations or words of encouragement, and I am completely up for that. It would be hosted on this channel, and it would be hosted in a similar manner to this, where there is not a lot of editing. There will be some degree of graphics. I think BKC has the phrase pseudo podcast with light visual elements, and I think that is just fantastic. I know YouTube doesn't like it for compression reasons, that this is a video platform, and it doesn't want you to have just audio-reliant videos. Understandably so, because compression is difficult, and hosting the content, because everything that they have to store and every time they have to stream, that's a little bit of processor and a little bit of server power that they have to allocate. I think the obvious solution is just have AudioTube as a little subsection, or maybe even curated podcasts on YouTube, where that wouldn't be a factor. You wouldn't have to worry about having such visual flourish, but that's way beyond my pay grade. As for affirmations or words of encouragement, I am completely up for it. I just need to know what to say, and this is one of the times where getting comments from the audience is very helpful. Not in the way that I want to fish for engagement, but just because I don't know what to say. But if you have a longer request, or if you feel like that form of engagement is not ethical, then you're welcome to just send an email. And I have the email address. Well, I guess the email address for this channel would be TCGT Extra. Just email at TCGtheory or TCGT Extra. Either's fine, and I'll get to recording some words of affirmation when I have time. I know a lot of people enjoy just listening to a monotone voice about topics that may be related to their interests, or maybe just because they like falling asleep, and I am completely okay with that, because so long as I'm providing something that people enjoy, I'm not going to be upset about people falling asleep. And getting more personalized, or even more generic but universal words of affirmation might be helpful for a lot of people. And one of my favorite content creators is Tomato Anus, who has an unfortunately bad name. I think it's even self-selected, which makes it worse. But he has speedruns, mostly for the Fallout series, which I quite enjoy. And it caught me off guard the first time, But it seems like a lot of videos, he just interrupts the commentary, not in a way that breaks the flow or removes depth from his detailed analysis of the speedrun, to address the audience and make sure that people are being thoughtful and caring, not to the channel, but to themselves, to give them a little bit of encouragement and make sure that there are some positive words. And that would be fantastic. At this point, I don't feel comfortable integrating that into larger content, just based on the way that my style is. It's rather short, not in this instance, of course, and focused, and to some degree too much in times, as people have asked for elaboration. But that is definitely something that I am willing to do. I might be able to do some reading of books that are in the public domain, but again, that's something that YouTube doesn't like. They actively disincentivize reading of public domain books for content. It's a little bit weird. I think it might have to do with other services. They don't want to step on audiobook suppliers, but they're in the public domain, and in my mind, it's a public service to give some more books that more access to audiobooks on YouTube. I'm not going to worry about that too much, though. Again, way above my pay grade. But speaking of literature, I have had more time to read, and I do want to prioritize reading in the future. I've been in court, and it's a lot of hurry up and wait, where you gotta get there, gotta get into the room, and then maybe wait for 20 minutes because the next officer isn't ready yet, which is understandable because there's a lot of people that have to be coordinated. Each case is usually a different officer, and they have to take time out of their day or go off of their schedule to go and then be there for 20 minutes. And if someone's running late or if someone's early, it affects their schedule. It's understandable why it happens, and they allocate a full day, and we don't even use the full day most of the time. But that's going back to the criminal justice system. Digression is the word of the day. I have been thinking, since I've been reading more, that I want to share some of what I have read. This is, I guess, the video-audio version of Reader's Digest. The books I'm going to be choosing are a little out there. I'm trying to read source material which will help me in future projects, and right now I'm reading through some science fiction books because I have a science fiction project that I want to do. It does involve card games, to return to the channel. In fact, it is for a card game that I plan on making. Development is slow on that front, though. Still in the conceptual stage where I'm doing research and analysis. The first book that I'd talk about, and this will be soon, would be Earthman Go Home, which is also Ellison Wonderland, has multiple titles. I'm not sure where you can get it, because it's like 50 years old at this point. I saw it because it had a picture of like Robbie the Robot on the front, and ooh, humanoid android, this looks fun. And it's Harlan Ellison, who you might recognize from A Boy and His Dog, which is one of the stories that is behind Fallout as far as influences. He also wrote City on the Edge of Tomorrow. I happen to have an autographed copy of, which is crazy, not autographed by Harlan Ellison, but autographed by Will Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. It'd be great to get Ellison's autograph too, but he has since passed. As has Nimoy, So Earthman Go Home is a collection of short stories, and the first entry of what I'm hoping to call Liber Solum, or Latin for Book Lonely, as far as a book club, because Lonely Book Club was taken, and basically it'd be where I read a book and then talk about it to the audience, with a few small sections directly quoted from the book. I think in Earthman Go Home, I'm going to read just the little bit of description on the back of the book for each short story, because I think that's interesting. Talk a brief synopsis about the story, what I have taken from it. And there's one story in particular that I am going to read a short passage from, which I know is not technically allowed. I know it's for research analysis and I'm not making any money from it. It's discussion and critique, so it should be covered under US fair use, but should be and YouTube don't always line up. But that's going to be more content, probably a bit more structured than this one, yet still interesting and enriching, or at least I hope it will be interesting and enriching, exposing people to a little bit different literature. This project is going to be retro-futurism, not necessarily in the Fallout sense, which I seem to be talking about quite a lot, where it's a lot of the design aesthetics from the 50s. It's going to be the boom of the space race age, where I'm going for late 60s, early 70s. As far as other books, I'm going to try to alternate between a science fiction and a science or history book. So I actually have the second Genesis lined up after Go Home Earthman. I'm still working on that one, but it's really interesting. I'm actually started annotating and just putting sticky notes, and it looks like every page in the last chapter has one, just because of all the things that they introduced. It's written in 1969. I actually have the 1975 reprint. So this is right after the moon landing and the first heart transplant. So we're at two watershed moments as far as human history. There's so much optimism and speculation, and it is just interesting seeing where some of these things went, how it panned out, and I am struggling to not turn this into a huge commentary. I might even break that one up into 3 distinct pseudo-podcasts, just based on the amount of content. But if you do want to participate in Lonely Book Club, or Liber Solum, which would make it the plural, so Liber Sola, then the first 2 books are Earthman Go Home, Harlan Ellison, and the second Genesis by... I don't have it on me at the moment. As far as future content on the main channel, I do want to streamline series a bit, return to What If Wednesday, because that one's really fun. Unfortunately, nowhere near as frequent will be possible, but just being able to engage with the audience is fantastic. I have quite a few interesting questions. The next one's actually going to tackle the anime and ask a what if question about Yu-Gi-Oh! GX, because I think just talking about the main game or just talking about aspects that I want to change in the main game is a little bit limited, and I want to make sure that there is a good integration of different ideas towards the wider Yu-Gi-Oh! There's a lot of people, and I had a suggestion to cover the manga more often, and that's a fantastic suggestion because there's a whole bunch of weird and fun and interesting stuff that's not even in the anime, and even less gets into the actual main game. As far as series that I definitely want to continue with some degree of regularity if possible are the History of the Bandless videos, because they're not time sensitive and they're data driven. I quite enjoy them because I learned something pretty interesting every time. Of course, this goes back into that one video I want to do with banning philosophy, or the philosophy of why cards are banned in games. But talking about the historical aspect is very fun because you get snapshots of metagames, and talking about the competitive overview for each year, those take quite a long time. It's a lot of research, and it's actually going to be more research in the future because I'm going to be cross-referencing different sources as able. I figured out why some cards don't show up in the lists, in the deck lists, and it's any card who has had an erratum that affects their name, which is pretty general. And in particular, there's one archetype that got a name change, and it's going to be a challenge because the elemental hero monsters had their name changed to Hero, Hero, all in caps. This might actually be the hero super archetype in general got changed. I don't know if Oscillo Hero got changed too, but that means that those cards in the database I was looking at just don't show up because they had a name change and the card no longer exists in the form that it is. And that means I have to go outside of the website and try to find additional deck lists. I am looking forward to the next competitive overview game because the game is about to open wider. The archetypes are going to introduce a lot of diversity and as far as theory, and I won't have to focus so deeply on tech cards and talk about entire strategies and how decks evolve over time, which is going to be really fun, and I think something I'm looking forward to. It might be a good idea to put out other videos in between, and I have plenty of ideas, just getting them pared down to core concepts and figuring out how much to put out at one time is a little difficult. Because I got plans for longer videos, 20, 30-minute videos, which of course take a lot longer to make, to edit, and of course to narrate. I think the final thing as far as content that I've been considering is streaming some of the faster to produce content. And this is the most difficult one for me to think about. Of course, in the concept of not wanting to leave people out, that would mean streaming at different times because of time zones. Just trying to make sure that everyone has a reasonable time to maybe catch one live. I think definitely having a production schedule and lining them out and doing them at regular intervals would be helpful, but maybe additional ones that are just for the European audience or just for the, I don't know if I have any Chinese viewers, but I know that's 12 hours off of the Eastern time that I have right now. Maybe check into demographics before I commit to that, but I think it'd be nice to help with timing, make sure that everyone gets a reasonable time so that someone can catch it live, because it is just the feeling of being left out when you can't tune in live. And the other thing is watching a live broadcast after it's finished, where there's no longer that social element, can be a little sad, and it can actually really affect the quality of the content. Something that I'm a little concerned about as far as live. Yes, it's great because you can have audience commentary and you can have way faster and more meaningful interaction with the community. Fantastic. But it's not the normally produced high editing, high polish content that I'd be putting out. I think what I would try out with, and this is something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, is talk about cards. I think tiering is too restrictive, but I think looking at just a few attributes of each card would help for cube building or for specialty formats as far as ban list. There is just a few attributes that I think should be documented. Like, does this card do something really unique? Because if it does, then it has the potential for some weird applications that sometimes are game breaking, like Gravekeeper's Servant and Dimensional Fisser. It doesn't work with Macrocosmos, but specifically those two cards, because you do not know the top card on the deck, you don't know whether or not it gets banished when it's milled by Graveyard Servant, and as a result, you cannot declare an attack when those cards are both on the field. And that's not intuitive. Interesting. I'm not sure if that ruling is even still around right now. There's a lot of changes, especially with obscure cards like that. But I think having just a column of whether it's gimmicky or incredibly unique might add a completely separate dimension of, is this card useful in competitive play? Does this card have cube potential? And as far as streaming goes, lower production value, lower focus on detail, and a little bit of roughness, but just going through sets one at a time, which might take an hour or two. The early sets I'd probably go a lot faster, just because there's so many normal monsters, and normal monsters might all get the same rating. I know some are significantly better than others, like the Blue Eyes White Dragon always seems to be at least sort of useful in competitive play, as compared to, like that dinosaur card Urabi, which is not particularly good, or Two-Headed Dragon. There's quite a lot of small, insignificant vanilla monsters, and they'll probably be lumped together without too much worry. Of course, there are incomparables, and sometimes they're in archetype, which might be fun, actually. Just a list of all the vanilla monsters that happen to be in other archetypes, like the gladiator beast Andal, who can't tag out. So you can go from one gladiator beast to another, but just have Andal. It does mean you have a rescue rabbit target, though, so there's potential. Potential. But as far as content production, I think that's where I'm at, is thinking about and trying to fit in all of these things that are time-consuming, energy-consuming. There's quite a lot going on. I'm going to attempt to be as consistent as possible, but there will definitely be a lot of slowdown. As far as community posts, they might be more frequent, maybe accompanied with another TCGT cast, because I have a lot of things still on my mind. In fact, I wanted to talk about a couple films that I saw recently. Has nothing to do with this, but if you're one of the people that wants to fall asleep, then I have a pretty big discussion on how morality is portrayed in two different films. I think it's interesting. It's been on my mind. It definitely needs to be something. The areas of my mind need to be labeled empty so that they can have more useful information applied to them. So, if nothing else, there's going to be another pseudo podcast just to try to get these ideas out and not have to worry about them. Hopefully a lot less rambling, more structured when able, but that's where I'm at now, and hopefully this helps at least to quell any worries that people might have as far as me doing fine, because I'm okay. I'm just having to be more adult and not having the ability to dedicate myself to this pursuit. Not that the interest has waned, just that the ability and the time in the moment is a little bit difficult. That being said, don't despair. There's more to come as soon as I'm able.